Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. Today we'll have another sutta study, so this time looking at a discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, or sutta number 52.1. So this is the discourse that was asked about yesterday, so in which Venerable Anuruddha is speaking about Satipatthana. So we can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll start going through the discourse and talking a bit about its meaning. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, as mentioned, this is Samyutta Nikaya 52.1, which is entitled here the Paṭhamarahogata Sutta, the first discourse on solitude, which the discourse doesn't actually have anything to do with solitude, but that's beside the point. So the discourse begins, it says, Evang me sutang, thus have I heard, Ekang samayang ayasma anuruddho savatyang viharati jetavane anatapindikasa arame. So on this occasion, Venerable Anuruddha, so Anuruddha was one of the chief disciples of the Buddha. If I remember correctly, he was the chief disciple in Satipatthana, wasn't he?
Maybe Divine Eye was.
Divine Eye?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm wrong. So he's one of the Buddha's chief disciples, and but there's very few discourses given by Anuruddha. So most of the discourses are attributed to the Buddha. A small number are attributed to Venerable Sariputta, and much smaller numbers attributed to Venerable Ananda. And then there's a tiny handful of discourses which are attributed to other major disciples. So Mahamoggallana has a few, and then there's some by Venerable Kachana and Anuruddha and a few others, but not that many. So this is one of the few discourses attributed to Venerable Anuruddha. So he was living, at this occasion, he was living at Savatthi, so at Anathapindika's monastery, which is where the Buddha spent much of his time. So it says, Atakoyas mato anuruddhasa rahogatasa patisalinasa evang tetasa parivitako udapadi. So then when Venerable Anuruddha was in solitary retreat, which is where the title of this sutta comes from, just the fact that this happened while he was alone in personal retreat. It says, Evang chetiso parivitako udapadi. So this line of thought appeared in his mind. So he was thinking, Ye sanke sanchi chataro satipatthana viraddo te sang aryo mago samaduka kayagami. So he says, one for whom the four satipatthanas are viradda. So viradda has the sense of neglected or missed or not being successful at, or lost out on. And he says, Viraddo te sang aryo mago samaduka kayagami. So one who has neglected the four satipatthanas has neglected the noble path, which leads to the complete elimination of dukkha. And then correspondingly, he says, Ye sanke sanchai chattaro satipatthana aradda. Araddo te sang aryo mago samaduka kayagami. So one who has undertaken the four satipatthanas has undertaken the path which leads to the elimination of dukkha. So here he's drawing a direct connection between satipatthana and the ending of suffering, the ending of dukkha, which is important because, again, the satipatthana practice is one of the 8 steps of the Eightfold Path. So while it's not self-sufficient as a complete path to awakening, it is one of the important components of the path to awakening. So what he's pointing to here is that if one does not make an effort to take on the practice of the four satipatthana, then one is missing out on a critical element of the path. And the next line, it says, Atiko ayasma mahamogolano, ayasmato Anuruddha Satejaso Cheto Parivitaka Manyaya. So it says, then Venerable Mahamogolana knew this thought that was happening in Venerable Anuruddha's mind. So Venerable Mahamogolana was the foremost of the bhikkhus in psychic powers, which included the ability to read minds. So on this occasion, he was watching Anuruddha's mind, which slightly creepy invasion of privacy thing going on here. But again, the idea is that he's doing it out of compassion, out of the wish to help his fellow monks to make progress towards awakening. So it says, Sayatapi nama balava puriso saminjitang vabahang pasare tang vabahang saminjaya. Evameva ayasmato anuruddhasa samukhe patra hosi. So just as a strong person might extend a contracted arm or contract an extended arm, Venerable Mahamogolana appeared in the presence of Venerable Anuruddha. So in addition to telepathy, Mahamogolana could also teleport. So he had lots of interesting supernormal powers developed. There's also a number of suttas where the Buddha does these sorts of things, where the Buddha will read somebody's mind and then teleport into their presence and give them a Dhamma talk, which I imagine could be a little bit disconcerting, but it's the Buddha, so you know that there's nothing to be worried about. And according to the commentaries, and I don't normally follow the commentaries, but according to the commentaries, at the time of the Buddha, it was a normal custom to always have an extra seat set up, just in case the Buddha suddenly teleports into the room. You would always have a seat that you could offer to the Buddha. Doesn't say this anywhere in the suttas, it's just in the commentaries, but I still find it really cute. So, Atiko ayasma Mahamogolano ayasmatang anuruddhang eterabocha. So then Venerable Mahamogolana asks a question to Anuruddha. He says, Kitavata nuko avaso Anuruddha bhikkuno chattaro satipatthana arada honti. So he says, well, how is it that a monk has undertaken the four satipatthanas? Anuruddha is thinking, it's if one neglects the satipatthanas, the one is neglecting the path to the end of dukkha. If one commits to the satipatthanas, the one is committing to the path that leads to the end of dukkha. So then he asks, well, then how does one commit to this path of the satipatthanas? How does one undertake the satipatthana practice? And so then Anuruddha gives a description, and this is a little bit different from what we see in the Satipatthana Sutta. So it's good to pay attention and see what the distinction here is. So he says, Idabuso. So he says here, Venerable, Bhikkhu ajatankhaye samudaya dhammanupasivaharati. So here a bhikkhu dwells, observing the nature of origination in the body. So internally observing the nature of origination. So noticing the arising of physical sensation, noticing the coming into being of this bodily experience. And ajatankhaye vaya dhammanupasivaharati. So one dwells internally observing the nature of disappearance, of cessation in the body. So noticing that, again, these body sensations keep disappearing. So they appear and they disappear. They arise and they cease. So this is one way of talking about the practice of anicca sanya, the recognition of impermanence. Observing the constant arising and ceasing of body sensation as a way of practicing anicca sanya. He says, Ajatankhaye samudaya vaya dhammanupasivaharati. And he says, and one develops observing the nature of both arising and ceasing. So one can take this as the simultaneous observation of arising and ceasing. So the first one is observing arising, the second one is observing ceasing, and the third one is simultaneous observation of arising and ceasing. But these are all ways of again, paying attention to impermanence. So impermanence is the constant appearing and disappearing of sensations, of phenomena. And he says, atapi sampajano satima. So atapi means ardent. It actually comes from the word tapas, which means heat or burning. So atapi is like fervent, like you're on fire for something. So this like fervent dedication. Sampajano means completely knowing or thoroughly understanding. And satima means mindful. So this is, again, straight from the Satipatthana Sutta, this phrase, atapi sampajano satima, as a description of the kind of attitude that we should have towards our meditation practice, that we should be practicing with fervent dedication, with full awareness, and with clear mindfulness. And it says, Vinaya lokaya bija domanasang, and one has removed any covetousness and depression regarding the world. So towards anything in the world, there's no wish to acquire anything. So there's no greed mind, no craving mind. But there's also no domanassa, so no downheartedness or depression regarding anything in the world. So no matter what's going on in the news or what you wish you're getting that you're not getting, or what's going on with your family or whatever. So we set all of that aside. So recognizing that samsara is just samsara. There's pretty things in the world, pleasant things in the world, and but there's no point in seeking them. And there's depressing things in the world, but there's no point in being depressed about them. And then he applies the same thing to bahidda kaye, so externally in terms of the body, and then ajata bahidda kaye, so internally and externally in terms of the body. And for each one, giving the same analysis. So observing the nature of arising, the nature of vanishing, and the nature of both arising and vanishing in the body. So then, again, so he's giving this description of observing impermanence through seeing arising and ceasing in the body sensations. And then he makes the statement, which is what was being asked about yesterday. He makes this statement, so sache akankati. He says, so if one wishes, apatikule patikula sanni vihareyanti. So if one wishes, may I dwell, perceiving that which is not patikula as if it was patikula. So then we come to this word patikula, which is, it's sometimes translated as unpleasant or repugnant or distasteful. So it comes from the prefix pati, which means against or away. So it's this sense of something that you want to push away, something that you want to be apart from, something that you want to be separated from. And so he says one can perceive the non-repulsive as repulsive, so the non-disagreeable as disagreeable. And similarly, he says, sache akankati patikula apatikula sani viharayanti, apatikula sani tatu viharati. So if one wishes, may I perceive the repulsive as not repulsive. So the disagreeable is not disagreeable. So it's these, again, it's recognizing, as I mentioned with the question yesterday, it's recognizing that normally the mind automatically labels something as either pleasant or unpleasant, as either desirable or undesirable. But that if we're paying close attention to the mind, so far sati is well established, our mindfulness is well established, then we can notice the sensation as it arises, which is what he was just talking about. So observing arising and ceasing of body sensation. And we can recognize that there is a tendency of the mind to like certain sensations, to label certain sensations as pleasant, and to dislike other sensations, to label them as unpleasant. But if one is paying close attention to the mind, then you'll notice that impulse before it becomes fully developed. You'll notice the impulse before the mind goes into the corresponding activity of liking and disliking. So you'll notice that underlying tendency towards desire and aversion. And you might recall in the previous paragraph that Venerable Anuruddha had also specifically said, Vinaya loke bija domanasan. So this means having removed any covetousness and downheartedness regarding the world, about anything in the world. So we're already putting down this tendency of liking and disliking as much as possible. So here he's saying that when one's mindfulness is well developed, then it's possible to stay with the direct experience so that one doesn't fall automatically into this process. But that one can then, at this point, if one wants to perceive something as undesirable, then one can. Or if one wants to perceive it as desirable, then one can. So one can get full control over this liking and disliking process in the mind. And this is very important because this is necessary. It's necessary to understand the liking and disliking process if we want to overcome dukkha. Because much of our dukkha comes from not getting what we want and getting what we don't want. So if we stop the whole wanting process, then we're free from those two kinds of dukkha. And then he makes 3 more statements, which this gets a little more refined. He says, Sache akankati apatikule cha patikule cha patikula saniva harayanti patikula sanitatavarati. So he says, and regarding that which is both disagreeable and not disagreeable, then if one wishes to perceive it as disagreeable, one can. So something which has a mixture of pleasing and displeasing qualities, then one can choose to perceive it as exclusively disagreeable, displeasing. And similarly, the next one, patikule cha apatikula saniva harayanti. So one can also perceive it as not disagreeable. So something which has a mixture of agreeable and disagreeable qualities, you can perceive it as exclusively agreeable. So again, recognizing that one can get full control over this liking and disliking process, and therefore undercut the underlying generation of dukkha. And then finally, he makes the most important of these 5 ways of training the mind. So he says, he says, Sache akankati apatikulancha patikulancha tadubayang abhinavajetva upeka kovihareyang sato sampajanoti. So, and if regarding that which is disagreeable and also that which is agreeable, one can go beyond both. One can evade both and dwell with equanimity, mindfulness, and full awareness. So this is actually what we're aiming at. So first he's talking about recognizing that this whole process of liking and disliking, agreeable and disagreeable, is something that we can take control of. So if we want to see something that we normally find disagreeable as agreeable, so an example of this is arugula. So I always found arugula something phenomenally disagreeable. But there's kind of this general understanding that it's healthy for you or something. So then at some point, instead of looking at arugula and thinking, that is that horrifically bitter and vile thing, instead it was looking at it and thinking, oh, that's good medicine that supports the body. So then that starts switching around the mind, and the mind starts perceiving it as agreeable rather than disagreeable, to the point where the experience of the flavor also changes. So nowadays, arugula is actually a tolerable experience for me. Haven't quite made it into the agreeable category, but at least it's no longer thoroughly disagreeable. So regarding the agreeable as disagreeable. So this is when we have craving for something which is unwholesome. So maybe you have this desperate craving to start smoking cigars right now. And you have this vague memory of like, oh, when I was a teenager, I used to smoke and it was really nice. And realistically, it wasn't. But our memory makes things seem a lot nicer than they were. You have this idea like, oh, that would be a pleasant thing. That would be a nice thing. But then you remind yourself like, well, actually, that would be harmful to my health and it's just fueling craving and it isn't going to do any good. Then you start perceiving the drawbacks, perceiving the degradation. And so then the mind will switch from seeing it as an agreeable activity, a desirable activity, to something as undesirable. But the highest practice, as he's mentioning here, is to go beyond this whole concept of agreeable and disagreeable entirely, to drop this whole liking and disliking and just to maintain equanimity. So through training the mind and seeing the agreeable as disagreeable or the disagreeable as agreeable, the one can get to a point where you leave behind this whole categorization of agreeable and disagreeable altogether. So eventually cultivating perfect equanimity. And then he applies the same principle to the other three satipatthana. So Vedana, which is feeling. So he goes through exactly the same analysis in terms of Vedana. And in terms of Chitta, which is the mind. So the characteristics of mind or qualities or aspects of mind. And finally, towards Dhamma, so the mental phenomena, mental activities and mental objects, which are observable. So similarly, applying the same analysis. So first observing arising and ceasing of the object of mindfulness. So any of these four satipatthanas. And then from that, recognizing this liking and disliking process, this tendency to categorize things as likable or dislikable, and to conquer that. So to learn how to switch the mind so that what the mind normally perceives as desirable, one perceives it as undesirable. Or what the mind normally perceives as undesirable, you can perceive as desirable. And then once you have that level of control, then you drop both completely and keep the mind in a state of poise, a state of non-reactivity, of equanimity. So then he concludes, he says, Etavata ko avaso bhikkhunō chattaro satipatthana aradahunti. So he says, in this way, Venerable, a bhikkhu has undertaken the four satipatthanas. So this is Venerable Anuruddha's explanation of the practicing the four satipatthana, and in particular here he's connecting the four satipatthana with equanimity. So using satipatthana as a basis for overcoming our normal tendency of automatically liking and disliking our experience, this tendency towards falling immediately into desire and aversion towards anything that appears. So he's pointing to the fact that with sharp, precise mindfulness, then one can recognize the sensations as they arise and prevent the mind from going into that automatic reaction of wanting and rejecting. And in so doing, to keep the mind in a state of calm, of serenity, of equanimity. So I think that's enough on this sutta. So I think we can go ahead and respect the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And I'll take any questions that you might have. So hello to the people joining in online. So hello to John, Kumu, Kit, Manal, Tate, Priyani, Christina, Jayanta, and Yankee. Good to see all of you. And I don't see any questions online. You have a question?
Can I have a 2-part question?
Start with the first part. Otherwise, I'll forget the second part, or forget the first part by the time you get to the second one.
Yes. is it a process of it really observing the Vedanas that arise, playing with those, observing that it's aversion, observing that it's liking, and trying with the force of the mind to flip that until you can not have Vedana arise?
Well, Vedana arises regardless, but it's trying to separate the experience of pleasure and pain from the sensation itself. So again, normally we eat something or smell something or hear something or see something or whatever, and we just immediately think, this is good, this is bad, this is pleasant, this is unpleasant, I like this, I don't like that. And we tend to treat it as though that's innate in the thing itself. So what he's talking about here is through closely watching our experience, then we can recognize that the liking and disliking is something extra that's being added. So one way of starting to break that is to deliberately try to perceive something in a different way than we normally do. So I mentioned in the case of arugula, so trying to perceive it as pleasant rather than as unpleasant. And in doing that, then the mind can actually start to switch around. And the point of that is not necessarily to make yourself like something that you normally dislike, but rather to break the habit of always going into disliking certain things. So it's by directly countering the habits of the mind, then we weaken those habits and we restore flexibility to the mind. And also recognizing that the underlying sensation is just whatever it is. So that underlying sensation in and of itself is not pleasant or unpleasant. It's just a sensation. Does that make sense? Okay. What's the second part of your question?
It goes exactly into the second part of my question, which is your example of arugula, conceiving of it as this bitter, horrible thing versus a medicine that's good for the body and therefore supports practice. Is that sankara?
Yeah, I mean, that would be an example of mental activities, which much of Buddhist practice is about using sankharas to our benefit. Yeah, so you can put that under sankhara. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? Maybe no? Yes?
I'll just tag on to the arugula conversation, because what was happening, what was arising as you were talking about being able to see like at the source in the moment, it arising. And until that point, what I was reflecting on, when one doesn't catch it there, the level of benefit, or speaking a little bit about the practice, like the same practice somewhat more after the fact, right? Which it seems like your arugula, I'm not sure if that was exactly in the moment or, perhaps a little bit later, but I think what I'm trying to frame is when one isn't catching it like in that very second, the benefit of trying to alter the perception later. If that makes sense.
Yeah, well, you start with what you have. So if we're not catching things the moment they arise, then whenever you do catch them, that's when you start working on it. So I think that's actually part of why this sequence of 5 practices is given the way it is that it's starting with a very realistic point. It's like most people, we're going to start where we're already fully immersed in hating this and craving that. So it's like, well, start where you are. So try to perceive the disagreeable as agreeable, try to perceive the agreeable as disagreeable. So trying to switch around that perception so that we can start to loosen up these rigid patterns of mind. And then as we start to loosen up those rigid patterns of mind, then you can start to get a little bit closer to the source of them. and you'll start to recognize more clearly the process of mind that's happening. So you start with where you actually are. Instead of just thinking, oh, I failed again. Oh, I failed again. Oh, failed again. Instead, it's like, okay, so right now, I'm immersed in the experience of hating something, or I'm immersed in the experience of craving something. Well, let's try flipping that around. And then what you'll find is that then over time, it becomes easier to catch it earlier, until eventually you'll get to a point where the sensation is there and the mind will not react at all. It will just stay with the sensation. Okay. And it looks like that's the end of the questions for this morning. So I think we can go ahead and conclude at this time.
Andamayang Dhammagadaya Sadhukarang Dadamase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami. Okay, we'll see you this evening.